Hello, class. It's just 2 minutes ago I finished my introductory part of the lecture. So now we're going to get to the endocrine system. This is your hormones and the glands that produce them, your thyroid, your pituitary, your adrenal glands, ovaries and testes, all these great things. So let's get right to it. So an endocrinologist, and some of you out there have been to an endocrinologist looking at hormones. Many of you thyroid issues and overactive, underactive thyroid, or reproductive issue problems, or it just depends, all kinds of things. So, and I'm always impressed with endocrinologists. And as you study this chapter, you'll be impressed too, because there's all these hormones, which are chemicals in your body. I mean, I don't know the exact number, but imagine like 50 different signaling chemicals, hormones, major hormones in your body, and they're coursing through your bloodstream and they're affecting your body. When you talk about signaling your body, you think about the nervous system, right? Nerves telling your biceps to contract, something like that. Then you have hormones too that are affecting your blood sugar, your reproductive hormones, your blood pressure, how much you pee, how much water you retain. All these things, the adrenaline, think about that. All these different hormones are influencing a lot of your metabolism, that kind of thing. And hormones can be more long-term kind of thing. Think about growth hormone, puberty, and monthly hormones, things like that. So, you think about nervous system as being kind of quick and specific, going to a particular muscle, something like that. So endocrine, endo, inside, is going to, it makes hormones, which are just chemicals, that are released from the cell, and then they go outside the cell, and then they go in the fluid, and the capillaries pick them up, and then they're in the bloodstream. They go throughout your bloodstream. So hormones, they are thrown into your bloodstream, and then your heart pumps them all over your body. So here's a hormone that has a specific job, right? It's going to do something. It goes all over your body. It washes over your eyeballs, your feet, your fingernails, It doesn't affect your whole body. Think of it's testosterone and it's puberty and you're growing hair in places. And it just goes to those particular hair follicles. They listen, they bind, they have receptors for it, and they react to it. While other tissues, most of them just ignore the chemical because they don't have a receptor for it. So the deal is, the signal is specific kind of shape of a molecule, and it's just broadcast in your blood everywhere. But only certain cells have receptors that are waiting for that signal, and it's going to affect them. So that's the deal. The other kind of gland we'll talk about, like your spit glands here, are exocrine, exits the outside. Endo means in, endo, right? So endocrine glands are called ductless because the exocrine go through ducts. Like my sweat glands have a little duct to the surface of my skin where the sweat is spewed out up there. Yeah, and so an endocrinologist here, you can tell she's taking a look at the thyroid gland. You can feel for lumps, or is it enlarged, things like that. And most importantly, they're going to do a blood serum, and they're going to look for the levels of all these hormones. And why I said I'm impressed with them is that you're going to see some of this complexity is that you have, in some cases, your hypothalamus in your brain secretes a releasing hormone, which goes to your pituitary gland that tells it to release like thyroid stimulating hormone. And that goes in the blood to your thyroid gland. And that tells the thyroid cells to secrete thyroid hormone. That goes in your blood, and it's going to go to certain cells that are going to influence your metabolism. Oh my God, right? Look at all these levels I've thrown in here, right? And so when you're looking at blood levels, you can look at, which is high and low, and then why, what's the cause? Is it a tumor? Is it a cancer? You can have tumors in parts of your body that secrete hormones. So you could have, tons of testosterone or something because you have a tumor in your lung that's secreting it, and you look to the testes and there's nothing wrong. And so, like I say, there's a beautiful complexity of all these chemicals that are going to influence your body. And there's often several levels of control. Yeah. And then we'll talk about other, besides endocrine glands, they shoot out the hormone. It goes in your bloodstream everywhere. We need paracrine. That's like, paraprofessional, paralegal. It's in the nearby, next to, in the neighborhood. And then autocrine, auto yourself. And so you make a hormone in it out of a cell, and it actually influences the cell that just secreted it. Weird, I know. So this is what we're going to spend most of our time looking at. You can see these cells. And we're going to look at the major endocrine glands. There's the thyroid, the adrenals, the big ones, pancreas. But you have hormone secreting cells throughout your body. When we get to the guts, we're going to talk about leptin and ghrelin. You guys heard of those two having to do with weight gain and hunger. So those are secreted by stomach cells, and then your heart secretes hormones too, the heart tissue itself. And there's lots of small clusters of cells secreting hormones. But we'll look at the biggies, the ones you can put your hands on. Well, you can't put your hand in your head, but pituitary and thyroid, adrenals, and things like that. So paracrine is going to, the signaling molecule is going to affect the neighborhood cells. So it doesn't travel far like a hormone does. But realize these endocrine hormones, they may be secreted way up here, and they may have the influence at the tip of your toe. And so the bloodstream carries the signal everywhere. And then autocrine, there's some situations where it's kind of like putting a sticky note on yourself. You're telling yourself something where the secretions bind to receptors on the cell itself. So auto, self, para in the neighborhood, endocrine into the bloodstream. Exocrine glands, and these can make copious amounts of fluid. You think about your salivary glands making all this spit, the glands in your stomach secreting hydrochloric acid, your sweat glands, the ones, your sebaceous glands that go onto your hair follicles and make your hair oily. So they always have a duct that is carrying the fluid. Yeah, so it doesn't go in the bloodstream, it goes out a duct. And the pancreas is an interesting one because it's both an endocrine and an exocrine. And we'll get to its function. But most of the pancreas secretes pancreatic juice, which has enzymes for breaking down all the food. It gets squirted into your small intestine to hit that food right away and neutralize that acid. So that's what most of the pancreas does. But there's going to be islands scattered within the pancreas. That'll be the endocrine function. And you guys know what hormones are secreted by the pancreas? Insulin, yep, and glucagon. So these are blood sugar hormones. Yep, in our first lab, you guys will do it. We'll give you guys, some of you have diabetes statistically in a class of 106. So yeah, a lot more experience than I do. But here you can get, if you don't have a lot of experience, you can hear a guy that has it talk about how he got it and give you some kind of the medical inside look at it. All right, so here's a gland, an endocrine gland, your thyroid in your neck here. And the cells themselves are going to secrete the hormone, thyroid hormones, into the bloodstream. And the bloodstream is going to carry it away from the thyroid, and your heart's going to push it everywhere. Yeah. Here's a sweat gland in your skin. And in there, from the surface of your skin, there was an invagination, and it's a long tube, and those cells are making sweat, watery, salty sweat. And that's going to go out this tube and come out on the surface of your skin to help cool you. That's an exocrine gland. Quite different. They're both making a product, but the exocrine is going to make some kind of product like digestive juices or spit or sweat. Endocrine glands are going to make hormones. Molecules in the bloodstream, they're going to have effects on the cells that have receptors for that hormone. Yeah, and so when I look at signaling in my body, I think nervous system, check, endocrine system. Maybe you didn't think of that second one until today's lecture, but the nervous system. I want to, I step on a nail, my muscles, I react very quickly. It comes from my brain, out my nerves. And y'all know exactly what happens at the end of that, nerve at the, there's going to be the synapse. There's going to be little vesicles filled with neurotransmitter. You guys remember what the chemical is here at the neuromuscular junction? I know you do. I know most of you do. Acetylcholine. And that's is the signaling molecule that will be released from the end of that axon, and it will bind to receptors, in this instance in a muscle, that will help you, pull your leg away to prevent more damage. Now, the endocrine system, sometimes a neurotransmitter, the chemical is a neurotransmitter in the nervous system, like acetylcholine, but epinephrine is one too, and it's also a hormone, and it works both ways. So you can directly increase your heart rate with a nerve going right to your pacemaker to speed it up, or have adrenaline, epinephrine, be secreted from your adrenal glands. It goes over your blood. It's also going to speed up your heart. Yeah, you guys can look at this animation. I don't need to spend time in this lecture, but the PowerPoint is up on Blackboard. You can open it, you can modify it, you can click on this link, and it's just a 4-minute or so YouTube video that I found kind of a good overview. So take a look at that to help you study. All right, so nervous system versus endocrine. It's kind of like an email versus a Facebook post or a Twitter post, all right? So if you want to tell someone something, you can send them an email, and it's specific. It goes right to them and only them, all right? Now, if you want to send a signal to someone, you could also put a Facebook post. You can vague post. You can, let's say you put up this post and like only your ex-girlfriend or ex-boyfriend knows what it means, So again, you've put the post up there and only one person is specific, but everyone has to read the damn message, all right? So that's the deal is just like that. So hormones are like a Facebook post where it's thrown out the body and most of the body ignores it, but some of them have receptors and they're the intended target and they're going to react, all right? An email, like the nervous system, the nerves go to a specific spot, and then that chemical goes to a specific receptors there. Yeah, so that's the big difference. Yeah, so I was going to scream out in a room with a whole classroom. You're all going to hear it, but only some of you, is going to be directed towards. And so that's like what a hormone is. And normally we talk about, nervous system can be very, very fraction of a second, right? Very quick. And then, and that adrenaline rush, you almost get an accident, you feel that adrenaline rush. It can be very rapid too. But a lot of hormones can last long periods of time. So your growth hormone, as you're growing up to puberty, monthly estrogen, progesterone, and luteinizing hormone that influence cycles happen over long periods of time. So normally the nervous system reacts, that acetylcholine has to be broken down, and then it's over, and then you can hit it again like that. Hormones can have more long-lasting effects because the chemicals are there, they bind to cells, and it can take time. But the chemical signal, like I said, the chemistry itself doesn't matter. It's just, what matters is the shape of the molecule is specific. There's specific receptors that it binds to. And so whether it's a neurotransmitter or hormone, they're just different chemicals. Sometimes they're the same chemical, but it's just a signaling molecule called a ligand sometimes. All right, so like I said, there are endocrine cells scattered, especially in your gut and throughout your body, that are secreting hormones. A lot of them work locally, paracrine, and some work all over your body. In this chapter, we're gonna focus in on the bigger, more important glands. Really none more important than your pituitary. You're gonna see, it's got, we're talking about 8 hormones of that sucker. Your thyroid, a lot of you are familiar with that because there's a lot of thyroid issues in people, but secretes a thyroid hormone, and then that with the parathyroid secrete hormones for your blood calcium. Adrenal glands on top of your kidneys, adrenaline obviously, but then the outside of it, the cortex, is going to secrete corticosteroids, cortisol, it's kind of a stress hormone, hydrocortisone cream, so we'll talk about that. And then we'll get to your pancreas, which we'll talk about the digestive system, but here, its importance in blood sugar, right? If you're diabetic, one cause is that your pancreas does not secrete insulin. All right, big ones. And then ovaries and testes, of course, secrete estrogens, progesterones, things like that. We'll talk about that, and we'll talk about a reproductive system chapter. Yeah, and I'll mention a few other glands, miscellaneous glands. All right, so what are hormones and glands? Their importance. Yeah, I would say, looking at metabolic processes, looking at your metabolism, how much you burn carbs and sugars and fat, and water balance and blood pressure. Oh, yeah. You guys like, what the hell? I mean, oh, yeah. Well, I'm thinking ahead of, all the things that hormones do, that they are going to influence how much you pee out, how much water you lose. And the amount of water you retain is going to increase your blood pressure. And then there's hormones that affect your heart. They're going to affect your blood pressure, right? And then big time, growth hormone you've all heard of, and your estrogens and testosterone, things like that are going to be very important in our reproduction. Yeah, we'll talk about that. Humans are strange. We have this menstrual cycle, this monthly thing, and our ovulations are hidden, in the middle of our cycle, whereas most animals go into heat, mammals, and where they advertise when they're receptive, and they go into heat. Think about deer, dogs, and things like that. So anyway, interesting. Well, this is a moth, and is this a male or female? I'll wait. It's 50-50. That's a male, all right? And what this moth does is that on that antenna are these receptors for chemicals. And this kind of moth is like a Cecropia moth, this big, beautiful moth. We have them in Maine. Maybe you guys have seen a huge brown moth. It's just amazing. The females hatch, from caterpillar, chrysalis. They hatch out, and the females go about their business, and they give off these chemicals that float in the air. And the males use these antenna with these receptors to determine what direction that female is in. And he'll keep flying until he reaches the female. His only job in this world is to mate with a female. These Cecropia moths, maybe you guys have seen Luna moths here in Maine, big kind of greenish ones with a tail, beautiful. These moths, they don't even eat. They last for a week or two, and then they die. They don't have mouth parts. Their only job is to find a female, mate, and the female's only job is to lay eggs on the right kind of plant so those eggs can hatch into caterpillars and continue on. So these chemical signals now are not within the body of the moth, but the female's giving them off, and the male's being receptive to that. And they're not called hormones, they're pheromones. So I want you to know what a pheromone is. It's a chemical that is used for communication within a species, between individuals. Yeah. And so big time, you think about, how much your dog can get from sniffing other dogs' butts or fire hydrants, things like that, getting a lot of information, right? Our sense of smell is pretty reduced. And there are alarm pheromones. If a fish is getting attacked, it gives off pheromones, so its buddies know that there's a predator. So it's some kind of chemical given off that tells other individuals. So it's not hormones only within your own body. My adrenaline does not transfer to your bloodstream, right? It's just myself. Yeah. And interestingly, are there human pheromones? And easy answer is yes, but the hard answer is how important are they? Yes, you can see we talked about sense of smell last semester. Women are better generally sense of smell, and the information we can get from certain sweat glands, these apocrine, these big glands in our armpits and our groins, give off proteins from our body that tell about our DNA, about how related we are. Do you want to mate with me? And our sexual condition, all these things. So pretty cool. And tears, again, this is amazing that it's been shown, they've collected female tears, and then they've also just dripped saline off of a cheek of the same woman and collected it, put it in a swab, and they stick it in guys' noses, and then they measure testosterone levels in the saliva. And tears, real tears, have pheromones that make males have less testosterone, to make them more sympathetic, less aggressive and sexual. And so pretty fascinating to think about our pheromones being used out there. And you will see, you can look on the internet and find human pheromones, buy this, and no woman or man can resist you because it's using biology. And no, I mean, feel free to shop away, but very little evidence this is going to make much of a difference. It can't make up for your shit personality or something like that, So pheromones in humans, there's, you know, I think we have vestiges of it, and but there hasn't, you know, we don't run our lives like, you know, deer and dogs do by chemical signals like that. All right, so hormones, they are released. You have certain cells, and they are going to have the ability to produce these chemicals. The chemicals are released and they'll be picked up by the blood. And of course, you need your heart to carry this blood throughout your body. All right, looking at hormones, you guys will be memorizing. If you start new semester, you want to start really well, right? Get that list of hormones and just memorize what gland, what hormone, what it does. There'll be over a dozen. There's a bunch of hormones. So that's, you know, get yourself memorizing that. That's what my lab will help you with. My lecture will help you with. You guys study it so you know. So when you look at it chemically, there's really two classes of hormones. There are steroid or fatty hormones and non-steroid hormones, which usually proteins or pieces of proteins. So there's a big difference here too. The steroid hormones are like your estrogens and testosterone and cortisol. Some of these things from your adrenal gland, ovaries and testes, they're made from steroids, which are a lipid, right? And so you recognize, here's cortisol. You can see that it's got a cholesterol backbone, this thing, you recognize that. And so, yeah, it's all like testosterone too, or estrogen. And then amines, like, are made from amino acids, very simple like this. So epinephrine and norepinephrine are adrenaline and noradrenaline. It comes from the amino acid tyrosine, and it's modified and it becomes adrenaline, which has a huge effect all over your body. Here's a protein. This is just a long, right, string of amino acids. And of course, in real life, this long string would be folded to get that secondary and tertiary structure. So proteins are big. This would be a peptide. A peptide is when it's small. And there's no like real what number it is, but a small string of amino acids is a peptide, right? And then when it gets big enough, we call it a protein. And you can have a sugar on it, be like a protein. And then I'll have one slide on prostaglandins. We'll talk about that. You can see it obviously has like a fatty long carbon chain there. So this is chemistry, what they look like, all right? So you have, really, here's the big difference. You're gonna have the steroidal hormones and non-steroidal. Yeah. And these names, these don't mean anything to you yet, do they? They will. I mean, you know epinephrine, you know, because the EpiPen kind of thing, it's adrenaline, you know that. This is antidiuretic hormone, oxytocin, all these things like that. Follicle stimulating, thyroid stimulating. So know that the steroids, you need to know these are your sex hormones, adrenal hormones, are steroid based. All right, long list. And these all right here are releasing hormones from your brain that go to your pituitary. And so these are what I want you to really focus on. And if you look at the list, you're like, oh, snap, that pituitary gland is important. You can see all these hormones, 6 in the front half and 2 in the back half of this gland, all these hormones. It's kind of like the conductor of the symphony of your body, I've been called. So it secretes hormones that make other glands secrete hormones. So it's kind of in control. And actually your hypothalamus, your brain, really controls your pituitary. So it's really your brain. Your hypothalamus is in control. But your pituitary is this very important middleman. It's like you put the conductor, where's the nice outfit? He's right there, but behind the scenes, your brain is controlling it. All right, we'll get through all these. All right, so hormones, what do they get? How do they work? What do they do? How do they make you grow facial hair? And how do they make your heart rate go up? And how do they make you retain water? And all these things. They go in a cell and they're going to cause it to make a product or not make a product or make an enzyme or speed things up. Usually that's what they're going to do. And the cells themselves have receptors on them. The target cells, all right, have these receptors. And they're waiting for the hormone to bind with it. And so this is fascinating. It's the hallmark of addiction, too, to talk about this, is that Well, the amount of hormone you have can influence how big an effect it has. So a little bit of adrenaline, your heart speeds up. A lot of adrenaline, your heart's pounding. Right? So there's that. And then, so it depends how many receptors on the cell are being stimulated. One, a couple, all of them, it's going to have an effect on that cell. Now, your body also will adjust. And so if you're constantly have adrenaline, your body will make less receptors because it doesn't need as many receptors because you've got so much adrenaline. You don't need that effect. Yeah. And so it will call down regulating. You're going to make less receptors when there's an overabundance of it. And you're going to upregulate if the hormone levels really drop, then you'll make more receptors because your body needs more because there's only a little bit of signaling molecule. Yeah. So this is what happens when you have natural endorphins that make you feel good, after exercise, tanning, sex, things like that. Endorphins, I have this good feeling. Well, you can take morphine, or oxys, things like that, to give you that artificially bind to those same receptors. Now, if you start taking these pills or hormone, chemical, start taking them, what happens is that your body stops making its natural endorphins because you have an overabundance of it, and you start making less receptors on your cells because damn, I'm like awash in this. Sure, I feel good, but I don't need to feel this good. And so I get rid of the receptors. And that's why if you quit the drug, you have those withdrawals. You feel like crap because now your body has stopped making the natural feel-good chemicals because you've been artificially taking it. It takes a while to ramp that up again, and you have less receptors. And why smoking, you take any kind of addiction, the amount of product, you keep taking more and more to have the same effect. Yeah. Because you are down-regulating the receptors. You're making less and less and less because you have an overabundance of it. All right, you get it? So your body can react to the amount of hormone signaling molecule by making less receptors or more receptors. Yeah. So the hormone is in your bloodstream. What happens to it? Well, a lot of it just gets broken down, you pee it out, but some of it will reach a target and it will have that effect. We will see when you study hormones that some of them need carrier molecules. They don't dissolve in the water, especially steroid hormones. It's going to need something that dissolves in water to bind to it to help carry it. So if you get really into it, you get into, from pharmacy and medical type things that they look at, what's the percentage of bound hormone and unbound. And the bound hormone doesn't do anything, but the unbound can reach the cell if it's so just realize some things need a carrier molecule. Others don't. They can just dissolve and they're just carried in the fluid. And so the cells secrete the free hormone, and then some of that will bind to the cells in question and have the effect. Testosterone, I'm going to grow bigger muscles, grow facial hair. It's going to bind and have that effect. And some of it will just be degraded. And in the pharmacy business, we talk about it being either broken down by the kidneys or the liver, either renally or hepatically broken down. Okay? And so, and it's peed out. And so you make these hormones, it doesn't stay forever. Oh, I made hormone, I have it the rest of my life. It's broken down, you have to make new. It's the only way a signaling thing really works. You can't signal once when you're a baby and the signal's out there. You need to make it constantly when you need it and not have it there when you don't need it. All right, so the endocrine cells and the glands make the hormone, and the hormone, some of it needs carrier molecules, some don't. Some of it's going to have its action and be broken down, and then some of it's just going to be broken down. And so when you look at hormone levels, you can see what level they're at. Good stuff. All right, finally, not finally, but almost finally, we're going to look at how they have the effects on the cells. How do hormones change what a cell does to have some kind of effect? And in this case, we're talking about a non-steroid hormone. And a non-steroid hormone, let's say it's a protein, it can't get through the cell membrane. Cell membrane's fatty, remember? These are phospholipids, fat. It ain't gonna go through there. It's got a charge. It's hydrophilic, and the membrane's hydrophobic. So it's gonna attach to a active site on one of these proteins that's floating in the cell membrane. That's gonna have a receptor for that signaling molecule. And when it binds to this protein, the protein's gonna change shape, and it's going to activate or excite that protein into a new configuration. It's called the primary or first messenger, and then usually there's secondary messengers that are going to carry this signal to eventually it's going to have its effect. And the effect is, turning on an enzyme or turning off an enzyme. It can change the cell itself. And some hormones we'll see go right into the DNA and transcribe genes. So you start to make a product from that cell. Yeah. So we talk about, this first messenger is going to bind to the receptor on the membrane, altering a protein, usually an enzyme, that is going to change another molecule. And that molecule is going to change another. Usually there's a whole series of them, this pathway, until it has the effect where it's going to turn on an enzyme and start breaking down sugar, and so that glucose can be released, for one example. Now, steroid hormones, what's the difference? I gave you a hint here, talking about the cell membrane. The hint is that steroid hormones are fatty, so they have no problem swimming right through that membrane. So they don't stop at the front door, and they go right into the boss. So steroid hormones enter the cell, no problem. Their main problem is being dissolved in the blood, in the plasma, because they don't like water, but they have no problem getting through the membrane. And normally, the steroid hormone will come into the cell, even into the nucleus, and they're going to bind with a molecule that has a receptor for it. Sometimes there's a pair of them. And it's going to form this transcription factor. And that hormone is going to bind with these existing chemicals to make this powerful molecule. It's going to bind on the DNA and cause it to be read, or sometimes to block it, but to be read. And that DNA will be transcribed into messenger RNA, which will go out into the cell, and then ribosomes will convert it to a product, a protein. Wow. Yeah. So testosterone, cortisol, estrogens, they go right into the cell, into the nucleus, and they glom onto the DNA and cause genes to be read, to be transcribed into the messenger RNA. And so then they're going to go out in the cell, and then they will be translated into proteins, which will make whatever you're making. Yep. Which do you think is faster? The previous non-steroidal hormone or the steroid hormone? Which can be faster? Not the steroid, because this takes time, right? You've got to go in the nucleus. You've got to transcribe. Then you have to translate to make your product. Now, some other hormones, they just immediately turn existing enzymes on that are already there waiting. They just take off the safety cap, they turn them on right away. You can see how this would take a lot more time to go in, to transcribe a gene, et cetera. So, yeah, we're looking at steroid hormones. Look at all the basic configuration, don't they? Estrogens and testosterone, you know that. Cortisol, you guys have heard of that, stress hormone, cortisol. And then aldosterone is secreted by adrenal gland, affects kidneys to retain water, sodium. Yep. And a lot of these, they don't dissolve in water because they're fat. And so they need a transport protein. They need something that does dissolve in water that they can attach to, and that gives them a ride, a free ride. Yeah. Some of these steroid hormones can have very long, we call them half-lives. All these hormones have a half-life. How long do they last? So if your half-life is an hour, if you look at your hormone levels 100%, in 1 hour it'll be 50%. Another hour will be 25%. So we can talk about half-lives. And these often last a long time because they can be stored in body fat, right? The others tend to be peed out more. And again, they go right into the nucleus and they affect the genes. I just want to say your thyroid hormones are also happen to be hydrophobic. They don't dissolve in water, so they often need to be carried as well. All right, probably the most complicated slide of the lecture here, but this is how I told you how steroid hormones work. Non-steroid hormones, let's take a look. So you're going to have a binding site here, and that's going to be specific. And here's going to be the hormone coming in, and it's going to bind right to there. It's going to fit perfectly. And what it does, it's going to change the configuration of that molecule that's in the cell membrane. And we'll talk about these G proteins. If you guys get into more cell biology, you'll talk about G proteins. And the G protein is going to get excited, it's going to be activated. And here's a word for you, adenylate cyclase. Adenylate cyclase is going to be an enzyme that's going to convert ATP into what's called cyclic AMP, or CAMP. Now, ATP is adenosine triphosphate. That's ATP, gives us all our energy, right? AMP is adenosine monophosphate. So you've taken the ATP and you've gotten, oh my God. Oh God, I can't believe I did that. You get rid of 2 of the phosphates and you have 1 phosphate left. And when you do that, it tends to like make cyclic. It kind of comes back on itself. I'll show you a picture. But what's the big deal? Well, the CAMP is what kind of gets everything moving from there on. So the G protein excites adenylate cyclase, turns it on to convert the existing ATP that's floating around into CAMP. And CAMP will talk about a protein kinase, which is going to phosphorylate or put a phosphate on another molecule to make it active, to excite it. So phosphorylation is putting a phosphate on, and it often excites it. And you get it from ATP because you have that phosphate that can come off. All right. So real quickly, the binding site on the target cell, you're going to have a receptor for that. It's going to activate the G protein. Here we go. And that is going to excite adenylate cyclase. And its only job is to make ATP into CAMP. And CAMP, as long as CAMP is there, it's going to convert some proteins into this active form, which they in turn are probably going to go through 1 or 2 different steps, and they're going to start making something. They're going to activate an enzyme, so you're making the product, and you've turned on that cell with that signal. And again, the more hormone, the more G proteins, the more adenylate cyclase, the more of a reaction you're going to have, right? And this just shows, just review ATP. You better all know what the hell that is, right? So this is what powers our muscles. And it's the bonds here between these phosphates that do that. But if you remove 2 phosphates, you're going to get AMP. So you have ATP, ADP, AMP. Triphosphate, diphosphate, monophosphate. So you remove 2 phosphates, you're going to get AMP. And it turns out it's cyclic because it binds on itself to make kind of a circle. And the CAMP is just what's going to make the business happen in the cell from that hormone. What's important is that the CAMP is broken down, because if you don't break it down, it's always exciting the cell. The hormone is supposed to have an influence and then stop, not make an influence forever. And so I want you to know the enzyme that breaks it down is phosphodiesterase. Phosphodiesterase will break down CAMP, and at this point, we can put the phosphates back on it and recycle it. Now, the reason phosphodiesterase is important is because it prevents you from continuously exciting the cell. So epinephrine is adrenaline, and makes your heart beat faster, your pupils dilate, blood sugar goes up, ready to fight or flight. And what's interesting is that coffee, and caffeine, what it does, we know what it does is it inhibits phosphodiesterase. So it inhibits what's supposed to break down the CAMP. So the effects of adrenaline last longer. And so you drink that coffee, you have a prolonged higher heart rate because there's more CAMP in your cells and it's producing those effects. All right, so hormones are just molecules. They are just chemicals. The cool thing about them is that they fit in specific receptors, and then they cause that cell to do something. So like I said, the chemical itself doesn't matter. It's not, the chemical is just a signaling molecule. So it has to be unique, that's all. And what is so interesting, we get to this, is that one particular hormone can have very different effects on different parts of your body. I mentioned adrenaline. It makes your pupils dilate, so it's moving those muscles. It's going to make your heart rate go up. It's going to tell your pacemaker to speed up. It's going to open the blood vessels to your muscles in your brain, so you're ready to fight or flight. At the same time, it's going to constrict the blood vessels to your gut, because your blood pressure has to be evened out. If you open them somewhere else, I just told you that the same molecule dilated some blood vessels and constricted others. Doesn't that say like, wait, you're making a story now? It does. And so the point is I'm trying to make is that the signal is one thing. It's how the cell reacts, what genes it turns on is the effect. So you have hormones coursing throughout your body. Only certain cells are listening. And two different cells may hear the same signal and do something different. All right. So, yeah. Yeah, here's some adrenaline. You can see, you know the feeling, right? Your mouth goes dry, your bronchi spread out, your heart rate goes up, you start sweating, you feel your pulse in your neck, right? So all these things happen. And then aldosterone, we know it works on the kidneys, it has to do with retaining water. And recently we found receptors in your brain and elsewhere. So again, different parts of your body can react to the same hormone completely differently. It's not that one hormone can only cause muscles to contract or only cause glands to dry up. It can have different effects. Indeed, and this says it in some words here. I think I've already explained it well enough. All right, one slide on prostaglandins. And I got some pharmacy people out there. This is a complex thing here, but prostaglandins are paracrine substances. They work in the neighborhood, and they're real important. I think about inflammation and pain with prostaglandins. Important your uterus during childbirth, causing contractions. So they're powerful little molecules that are secreted by cells, and they work in the neighborhood. And they're not stored, they're made and immediately used. So it's an interesting class of drugs because pharmacologically, we look at ways to reduce prostaglandins because they cause inflammation and contractions. It turns out aspirin will inhibit prostaglandins, but you can read more about these if you like, but they often have to do with CAMP and how the proteins react to a hormone, either exciting or inhibiting, but they have these modulating effects, and we try to tamp them down when there's inflammation and pain. And they're fatty. I don't know if you can look at it, but they got these fatty chains. All right, well, I'll talk more about this later, but you definitely hear about abusing, steroids, anabolic steroids. Anabolic is building up, right? So we have learned to influence our hormones and birth control pills, we influence them. A lot of you out there influence them every day, right? Taking those, some of you with thyroid issues, take thyroid medications. And then for athletics, of course, you can take anabolic steroids to help increase muscle growth. And with that comes a lot of negative effects. Growth hormone also, see Sylvester Stallone, he's almost 70. I think he's actually older than this now, looking like that. Well, he was caught in the Sydney airport with human growth hormone. It's illegal. Wow, again, you guys into sports probably know more about what's legal and not, and how difficult it is to catch some of these things as a cat and mouse, where we learn, for instance, EPO makes you make more red blood cells. So bikers and people with extreme aerobic activity, it helps to have more red blood cells. It brings more oxygen to your muscles. And there's ways you naturally make EPO, and there's artificial EPO, and so. Anyway, there are ways that we use in sports to enhance our performance, all the way back to the Olympics, and the Greeks would take cocaine and things like that to help them perform better. And now we decide there should be a level playing field. It's dangerous for a lot of these things, so we try to keep them out of sports. But again, to cat and mouse and trying to evade detection. All right, well, your hormones, how are they controlled? It's normally a negative feedback. You make a lot of adrenaline. It causes you to be, really hyper and blood sugar and ready to go. And then that high adrenaline levels are going to negatively tell your adrenal gland, let's make less. We're fine. It brings it back down again, right? Childbirth ones and ones involved in sex can be positive feedback where it goes up to something, it builds and builds and builds. But most things you have, hormones are kept relatively constant, although never exactly constant, by negative feedback. The more there is, the less you make. The less you have, the more you make. So it keeps it kind of like that. Yeah. And so when you look at a hormone level, it's never going to be straight because it has this feedback mechanism. And so you make too much of it, you're going to make less of it. You make too little, you're going to make more of it. And so it's going to be there. And professionals, they do blood, they look at your blood and they know the levels, what these hormones should be depending on your sex, your age, and activity level. And they can note when there's an issue. Yeah. So this is just showing negative feedback. And I taught you this when we talked about just negative feedback and like your body temperature. So looking at it, let's see. So a lot of hormones we're going to see are, they start out the anterior pituitary gland. We're talking about 6 different hormones it makes. And it's really the brain, the hypothalamus, that has secreting, releasing hormones, sometimes inhibiting, usually releasing hormones that tell your pituitary gland to make hormones. And they go out and they tell another gland to make their hormones, which are going to go and cause, the effect. So when you have lots of a particular hormone out there, you start making more and more. See, the little red means negative. It's going to tell you, whoa, slow down, pituitary, or hey, slow down, brain, telling the pituitary. So you can have negative feedback there. This example of your adrenal gland, you actually have a nerves from your brain go right to your adrenal gland and causes it to secrete adrenaline. In that case, the adrenaline action is going to go right back and tell your brain, stop stimulating the adrenal gland. And then there are glands that are on their own, really. You look at your thyroid gland. It's measuring the blood for calcium levels. And they get too low, you're going to secrete this parathyroid hormone. They get too high, you're going to secrete this calcitonin, these hormones. Or your pancreas, it's always measuring your blood sugar. And if your blood sugar is too high, it secretes insulin, should bring it down. When it's too low, it secretes glucagon, like when you're fasting, should bring it back up. So these are, different levels you can control your hormones. All right, well, long lecture. We're gonna finish talking about the pituitary glands. That's it, and then for the next lecture, I'll get into the hormones of the pituitary gland and the rest of the glands. So the pituitary sits here in your sella turcica of your sphenoid bone. How's that for you guys reviewing, right? So it's right at the base of your brain. It comes off a stalk off your hypothalamus. And it's really hard to get to if you want to, do surgery on it. You sure as hell can't dig through the brain to get to it. So you got to go through the nose or the sinuses to get to it. And so there it sits. Look at that animation. You can see right at it's like a size of maybe a garbanzo bean, a chickpea, a lime, well, it's kind of the shape of a chickpea. And it sits right in there at the base of your brain. And it's a gland. And we're going to see it has 2 different lobes, an anterior and a posterior. And they're like night and day. All right. The anterior is your typical gland. It comes from the roof of your mouth, it comes up the cells and makes it. The posterior lobe comes down from your brain. It's part of your brain. And they come together to make a pituitary gland, but the lobes are from different sources. They're like night and day. So call the anterior lobe, also call it adenohypophysis. Your pituitary gland is also called your hypophysis. It's another name for it. The posterior lobe is neurohypophysis. I told you it's actually an extension of your brain. And so you see it here, sitting in that Turkish saddle. That's where it sits, a little stalk connecting it to your brain, your hypothalamus. Yeah. All right, this is the deal. Pay attention. The posterior lobe of your pituitary does not actually make any hormones. Okay, we'll do the posterior first. I think it's a little easier. What happens in the posterior lobe is that the hormones are made, there's only 2, ADH and oxytocin. They're made in the neurons of your brain, the hypothalamus. And then they go down the axon and they wait at the ends of the axons in your posterior lobe, which just looks like brain. And then when your brain says, dude, we need some oxytocin, it just releases it into that posterior lobe, and then the bloodstream carries it away. All right? Posterior lobe is brain tissue. The 2 hormones are actually made in the brain, but they're released down that lobe into your bloodstream. All right. Your anterior lobe has, 6 hormones that are made by the cells directly here. It's a real gland. And there's different neighborhoods that make different kinds of hormones. Growth hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone. All these things are made by cells in the anterior lobe of your pituitary. Now, the deal with this is that these cells don't do a damn thing on their own. They listen to the signal from the boss in the hypothalamus. So cells in your hypothalamus are going to secrete releasing hormones. A couple cases inhibiting hormones, but let's say they make releasing hormones that are going to be released into the bloodstream. Then there's this capillary bed that goes from your brain to the anterior lobe of your pituitary that's going to carry the releasing hormones down to the cells of the anterior pituitary. Isn't that weird? So the signal is given by one hormone. It just travels this short little distance to the pituitary, the anterior lobe, and then it's released. And then some cells there have receptors for it, and they wake up and say, oh, we got the signal. Time to make growth hormone. And then they release it into the bloodstream and it goes out. All right, so big difference. If you look at that histologically, you see the posterior lobe of the pituitary looks like brain. You can even see the stalk of the brain coming down. See that kind of light pink? It's just an extension of the brain. Anterior pituitary, see the dark color, it'll stain purple or dark purple, and it's because these cells are making hormones. And how do they know to make them? Because releasing hormones come through the bloodstream. It's called a portal system, where it goes from one capillary bed to another, and then it's going to wake up these cells and they're going to make the hormone. One more view. You can see here's your pituitary gland sitting in your sella turcica. And look at this. This is going to be posterior lobe and anterior lobe. And they look like night and day. And the posterior lobe, you can see the stalk is just an extension of the brain. And so again, two hormones are released in the posterior lobe, released, not made, oxytocin, ADH. Anterior lobe requires releasing hormones to be secreted. The bloodstream is going to carry them down, and it will release 6 different hormones. So if you look at the anterior lobe and you stain it nicely, look at this, all these different neighborhoods, like, oh man, this is the growth hormone neighborhood, and these cells are making ACTH. These ones are making thyroid stimulating hormone. They stain a little differently. So the cells are making all these different products. They're just waiting for the right signal for what they should make. And then this is even better histology, immunohistochemistry, where they really stand out. Here, the staining's a little different. You don't have to know this. This means just like the blue or the pink, which is going to stain best. This is like specifically staining the cells for specific chemicals. So it jumps out. These are the ones that make growth hormone. Yeah. And so they're waiting for a signal from the hypothalamus that binds to them. And they're like, yeah, it's our turn. We're making growth hormone. These other cells over here get the signal. They let it wash over them. Don't care. Not our releasing hormone. Don't care. And then this one's the other hormone over here. You guys get it? Hope so. This is the posterior lobe. Boring. Looks like brain. Blood vessels, and these are just going to be axons and neuroglial cells, and so nothing there. Anterior lobe, cells making something, right? Posterior lobe, just brain. It's just going to release a couple things that were made in neurons in the brain. All right, so the anterior lobe, and again, I'll catch you guys in person in lecture, but you're going to have something that's going to cause you to, your brain is going to sense that you need a certain hormone, and the hypothalamus is going to release a releasing hormone to the anterior pituitary, and that's going to secrete a hormone that's going to go out to some other target gland that's going to make another hormone. Yeah. So looking at it again, that's why it's a little complex, but hypothalamus tells the anterior pituitary to release, and that's going to tell like your thyroid gland to release thyroid hormones go in the body. And you can have this negative feedback at several levels, can't you? All right, just about done. I'm going to introduce these, and then in person, I'll lecture on all these. So this anterior lobe, indeed, growth hormone, growing. It can be abused as well. Prolactin, what do you think? Lactating milk. Thyroid stimulating. Oh, it's going to stimulate your thyroid. Oh my God, let's call this ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. It's going to be your adrenal gland, the cortex, the outside. Like, Follicle stimulating. Oh, your ovaries follicles, and they do something in the testes too. And then luteinizing, well, it's also involved. These are sex hormones. So lastly, again, one more time, just here's the blood vessel that has all the releasing hormones from your hypothalamus. And it's going to hit the bloodstream, travel a short distance down that river to the anterior pituitary, and then you're going to make these things. Yeah. Individual neighborhoods of cells will be woken up to make their hormones. Yep. All right, last slide. So your job today, after listening to this, is to take a nap maybe, but then after that is to make flashcards or start memorizing these hormones, where they come from. And my lecture in person, I'll go through all the hormones that we're going to talk about and the other glands. All right, so again, we have our lecture. This one is the recorded lecture, right? I have done half the lecture of endocrine system. You guys feel free to look at to read the chapter on this. You can see I follow right along with it. And your job is to hear me, take notes, read the chapter, do the Learn Smarts, take the quizzes, to take it from short-term to long-term memory. So you know this stuff for the exam and beyond. And that's what I wish for you. All right, it's a big day, new president, first day of class, well, for us. And yeah, hope you're all doing well. Really kind of happy to get back, see you guys. So, all right, have a good day.